Picture this. You're living in what you believe is a blissful marriage, certain about your future together, when suddenly you overhear a single comment that shatters everything. That's exactly how it unfolded for me. One simple sentence from my wife to her sister completely upended my world. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Feel free to share your thoughts, but let me walk you through how I made my choice and how it became the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The alarm clock jolted me awake at 6:30 a.m., its buzz cutting through the quiet morning. The familiar scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen greeted me, a small but comforting part of the routine I'd cherished during our 6 years of marriage. Sarah, my wife, was already up and moving, her usual morning energy on full display. It always amazed me how lively she could be so early. I stretched lazily, letting the moment linger before joining her in the kitchen. "Morning, sleepyhead," Sarah greeted me with her signature bright smile as she handed me a steaming mug of coffee. Her hazel eyes sparkled, just like they had the first time we met. Moments like this reinforced the idea that we were unbreakable, a team that could weather anything. Over breakfast, we talked about our plans for the day. Sarah had a packed schedule at the marketing firm where she worked, while I had a client meeting to prepare for in the afternoon. Everything about the day felt ordinary, routine, and safe, or so I thought. That evening, Sarah's sister, Nicole, arrived to spend the weekend with us. Nicole was the quieter, more introspective counterpart to Sarah's vibrant personality, but the two of them were incredibly close. Whenever Nicole visited, they would spend hours catching up. I never minded. It gave me a chance to escape to the garage and work on my woodworking projects. Later that night, I walked through the living room on my way to grab a drink from the kitchen. Sarah and Nicole were sitting on the couch, laughing over glasses of wine. Their laughter came to an abrupt halt as I entered. Sarah's face turned a faint shade of pink, but she quickly brushed it off, mumbling something about girl talk. "Don't let me stop you," I said with a grin, grabbing my drink and heading back to the garage. At the time, I didn't give it much thought, but in hindsight, there was something uneasy in the way Sarah looked at me. The following day, subtle things began to catch my attention. Sarah seemed glued to her phone more often, and whenever I walked by, she'd angle the screen away from me. She'd been coming home later than usual, always armed with a believable explanation. An important campaign, a last-minute meeting, traffic. I chalked it all up to the demands of her job. After all, trust was the foundation of our marriage, or so I believed. Nicole's visit only seemed to add to the strange tension. I couldn't put my finger on it, but their whispered conversations and the quick glances they exchanged made me feel like an outsider. When I asked Sarah about it, she laughed it off, saying, "Oh, it's just sister stuff, family gossip, you know?" But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, a gnawing feeling of being excluded wouldn't go away. On Saturday night, after Sarah and Nicole went out for drinks, I stayed up, waiting for them to return. It was close to midnight when I finally heard their laughter as they stumbled through the front door. I pretended to be asleep, listening to their muffled voices from the living room. As I drifted in and out of light sleep, I heard Nicole say something about settling. Then Sarah's voice, quieter now, responded with a laugh that sounded more forced than genuine. "If I could go back," she said softly, "I'm not sure I'd say yes." The words were vague but hit like a punch to the gut. I tried to convince myself it was the alcohol talking, that I was overthinking it, but deep inside, a sliver of doubt had been planted. By Sunday morning, Nicole had left, and Sarah seemed like her usual self again. She kissed me goodbye before heading out for a work meeting, leaving me alone in the stillness of our home. I stared at the empty coffee cup she'd left on the table, a strange heaviness weighing down on me. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure our life would ever feel the same again. For the first time, I found myself questioning whether the foundation of everything Sarah and I had built together was as sturdy as I'd always believed. It was one of those late, quiet nights where the silence felt heavier, and the ticking clock sounded louder than usual. Sarah had gone to bed hours earlier, or at least that's what I thought. I sat in my study, staring blankly at my work, but I couldn't focus. That lingering sense of unease from the weekend refused to let go. No matter how much I tried to brush it aside, it clung to me, a persistent weight in the back of my mind. Finally, I pushed back from my desk and decided to get a glass of water. As I made my way toward the kitchen, I caught the faint sound of voices coming from the living room. I stopped in my tracks. Sarah and Nicole? No, Nicole had left days ago. My heart began to race as I stepped closer, pausing just outside the doorway. Sarah was on the phone. Her voice, hushed but sharp, drifted through the dim room. "I know," she said, sounding frustrated. "It's not like I planned for this to happen." I froze, straining to catch the faint voice on the other end. I couldn't make out the words, but Sarah's sigh that followed felt heavy, too heavy. "It's just, I feel stuck. Daniel is a good man, but he's not exciting. I don't know how I ended up here." Her tone was laced with bitterness. I gripped the doorframe tighter, feeling the blood drain from my face. "If I had the chance to do it over again, I wouldn't," she added. "I wouldn't date him. I wouldn't marry him. None of it." I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. My stomach twisted, and I stood there, silently replaying her words over and over. She wouldn't marry me again? She regretted everything? How long had she felt this way? The person on the other end, Nicole, I assumed, murmured something too soft for me to catch. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "It's not just that," she said, almost sounding resigned. "I feel like I settled, and now I'm stuck here, pretending like everything's fine when it's not." Settled. The word landed like a gut punch. I could barely breathe. Was that all I was to her? A compromise? A safe, easy choice she regretted? The conversation continued, each word twisting the knife deeper. "Have you told him?" Nicole's voice became a little clearer. "No," Sarah answered quickly. "What's the point? It's not like I'm going to leave him. I mean, it's comfortable, safe. And besides," she trailed off. I held my breath. "There's someone else." Those 3 words shattered whatever hope I had left. I leaned against the wall, struggling to stay upright as my chest tightened. I wanted to storm in, to confront her, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. I stayed in the shadows, listening. "It's nothing serious," Sarah added, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. "Just someone at work. He makes me feel alive again. Alive again." I couldn't take it anymore. Her words sliced through me, each one sharper than the last. Quietly, I slipped back into the study, shutting the door behind me as softly as I could. I sank into my chair, staring blankly at my desk, my hands trembling. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, every sentence cutting deeper than the one before. She didn't love me. She regretted marrying me. And now there was someone else. A part of me wanted to march into the bedroom right then, to shake the truth out of her, to beg for answers. But another part, the part that had grown tired of feeling overlooked and disconnected, knew it wouldn't change anything. Her words had already said everything. I sat there for hours, frozen by a storm of anger, sorrow, and betrayal. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, my decision was made. There was nothing left to hold on to. I couldn't stay with someone who didn't love me, someone who saw me as a mistake. Sarah may have settled for me, but I wasn't about to settle for a life built on deception. Without saying a word, I began gathering my things. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater, and the pale morning light stretched across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to echo how I felt inside. From the bedroom, I could hear Sarah's steady breathing as I slowly opened the closet. I tried to be careful, not wanting to make a sound. My hands trembled as I reached for the old duffel bag tucked away on the top shelf. Every small movement felt burdensome, like the weight of what I was doing pressed down on me with each step. I packed only what I truly needed: clothes, my laptop, and a handful of sentimental items. The watch my father had given me before he passed. The worn leather journal where I occasionally spilled out my thoughts. I didn't want a confrontation, didn't need the drama. I just needed to slip away before Sarah woke up and before the reality of it all stopped me in my tracks. The hardest part wasn't packing. It was leaving behind the things that held little but powerful memories of our life together. The framed photo of us grinning like fools at the edge of the Grand Canyon. the mismatched coffee mugs we'd collected over years of road trips and lazy weekends. Even the frayed blanket we used to curl up under during movie nights. All those pieces felt like relics from a life that no longer felt like mine to hold on to. As I zipped up the duffel, my gaze drifted to the small wooden box on my nightstand. Inside was the letter I'd written to Sarah on our first anniversary. A long, heartfelt confession of love and everything I'd hoped for in our future. On impulse, I opened the box and slid the letter into my bag. I couldn't explain why, but taking it felt like reclaiming something, even if it was just a small part of what I'd lost. Before stepping out, I lingered by the kitchen table, debating whether I should leave her a note. I felt like I owed her some kind of explanation, but no words seemed enough to capture everything I was feeling, or everything I'd overheard. In the end, I scribbled something simple on a scrap of paper from the drawer. I heard you. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for. Daniel. I set it down on the counter, standing there for a few long moments, staring at the note like it might somehow explain everything I couldn't say. A small part of me hoped she'd wake up, come rushing out, and beg me not to go. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my bag and walked out the front door. The cold air hit me hard, stinging my face as I stepped into the driveway. My car sat quietly at the curb, waiting like it always did. I loaded the duffel into the trunk and let my eyes wander back to the house one last time. The curtains in our bedroom were drawn, but I thought I saw the faintest flicker of movement behind them. Had she heard me leave? Was she standing there, watching? I forced myself to let it go. It didn't matter now. The drive away from the house felt like a dream, or maybe more like a foggy blur of streets and stop signs I couldn't clearly remember passing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a need to keep moving forward, away from the life I was leaving behind. At some point, I ended up at a small roadside diner. I wasn't hungry. My stomach was twisted into knots, but I needed a place to sit and think. The waitress dropped off a cup of coffee, and I stared into the dark liquid for a long while, my reflection rippling on the surface. I felt a mess of things. Grief for the life I thought we had, burning anger over her betrayal, and surprisingly, a faint sense of relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore. The weight of keeping things together when they were already broken had finally lifted. By the time afternoon rolled around, I found myself at a modest motel just on the edge of town. The room was small and carried a faint smell of bleach, but it was clean, and more importantly, quiet. I dropped the duffel on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, the exhaustion hitting me all at once. For the first time in hours, I let myself cry. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just silent tears that rolled down my face as I stared up at the cracked ceiling. I grieved for the life I thought we were building, for the dreams we talked about, and for the man I used to be before I overheard those words. As the sun dipped behind the thin motel curtains, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this break me. Sarah might have thought I was boring and predictable, someone she had settled for, but I knew there was more to me than that. It was time to prove it, to her, to myself, and to anyone else who ever doubted me. Tomorrow marked the beginning of something new. As the first rays of sunlight slipped through the cheap motel curtains, they cast a soft golden hue across the room's faded walls. I hadn't slept much, maybe an hour or two at best, and my body felt the effects. Every muscle ached from hours of tossing and turning. My mind had been a relentless reel of everything I'd overheard, looping over and over. It felt surreal, like I was living out someone else's misfortune. But this was mine, my reality. There was no escaping it. I forced myself to get up, stepping into the shower in hopes the hot water would wash away the weight pressing down on me. Afterward, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at a version of myself I barely recognized. Bloodshot eyes stared back at me, and the faint lines that traced the edges of my face looked sharper, deeper than they had the day before. I rubbed my face with both hands, inhaling slowly. This wasn't the end. No matter how painful, it was just a new beginning. After checking out of the motel, I found a small diner down the road. The warm scent of coffee and frying bacon hung in the air, offering a bit of comfort. I still wasn't hungry, but I slid into a corner booth with a cup of coffee anyway. As I sat there, staring at my phone and scrolling mindlessly, The weight of how quickly life could shift hit me. Just yesterday, I was at home, thinking about dinner plans with Sarah. Now I was here, a man starting from scratch, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart. I dialed Josh, my closest friend since college. If anyone could help me untangle this mess, it was him. "Mike, what's going on, man? You sound off," Josh said the moment he picked up. "I left Sarah," I replied bluntly. The words felt heavier out loud, like admitting it anchored them in reality. Silence stretched across the line. "What? Why? What happened?" I hesitated, not sure how much I was ready to share. "She doesn't love me anymore," I finally said. "She's been seeing someone else." Josh exhaled sharply. "Jesus, Mike. I'm sorry. You okay?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I couldn't stay, not after hearing that. I can't pretend everything's fine." His voice came back steady, reassuring in a way that only an old friend's could be. "You did the right thing," he said. "You deserve better than that. If you need a place, you're welcome to crash here for as long as you want." I thanked him, but something in me knew that wasn't the answer. Staying with Josh felt like running, like pushing the whole thing aside. I didn't want to hide from it. I needed to face it head-on and start piecing my life back together. For the next few days, I drove around town, looking for a place to stay. It was harder than I thought. Most of the apartments were either way out of my budget or too far from work. Eventually, I found a modest one-bedroom on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, plain walls, small kitchen, but it was something. Signing the lease felt like more than just paperwork. It felt like the first small win in taking back control. Moving in, though, was a different story. I didn't have much, just the clothes I'd packed and a handful of personal items. The space felt empty, almost too quiet, but at least it was mine. I decided early on that I wouldn't try to fill it with reminders of the life I'd shared with Sarah. This was a fresh start, and I wanted the apartment to reflect who I was now, not who I had been. When the silence got too loud, I found comfort in woodworking. It had always been a hobby, something I'd done on weekends, but now it felt more like a lifeline. In the evenings, I'd slip down to the small garage attached to the building, losing myself in sanding, carving, and shaping pieces of wood into tables and chairs. There was something calming about it, the repetition, the focus. It gave me purpose when I felt like everything else was unraveling. Josh nudged me into therapy. I was reluctant at first, convinced I didn't need it, but after a few weeks I gave in. Dr. Adams, my therapist, was patient, calm. He helped me sift through the tangled mess of emotions I'd been carrying since I left. Slowly, I started to realize that Sarah's choices weren't a reflection of my shortcomings. Her affair wasn't about me, it was about her. Letting go of that guilt wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The hardest part was resisting the urge to reach out. There were nights I almost called Sarah, nights I wanted to demand answers, to understand why she'd made the choices she had. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. She'd made her decision. I'd made mine. And little by little, I began to feel like myself again. I threw myself into work, buried my energy in hobbies, and made an effort to reconnect with old friends. It wasn't smooth sailing. Some days, the weight of everything still felt like it might crush me. But I pressed forward, one slow step at a time. I didn't know where life was headed, but for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope, a faint but steady light. This was my life now, and I was determined to rebuild it. A few weeks had passed since I walked away from Sarah, and though the ache still lingered, it had softened into something I could carry without it breaking me. I had settled into my small apartment, decorated it with a few of my woodworking projects, and gradually, the emptiness I felt started to give way to something closer to normal. Work kept my mind occupied, and therapy helped untangle the mess of emotions I'd been holding on to. Yet, even as the days passed, one lingering thought wouldn't let go. How deep did Sarah's betrayal really go? The answer found me when I least expected it, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had just returned from grabbing groceries when my phone buzzed. I glanced down to see a name I hadn't thought I'd hear from again. Nicole. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. I hadn't spoken to her since that night, and just seeing her name stirred up a mix of emotions I wasn't sure how to handle. "Hey Daniel, can we meet? I think there's something you should know." I stared at the message, my grip tightening around the phone. After a long pause, I finally replied, "Sure. When and where?" We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. I arrived early, sitting by the window and sipping coffee as I tried to guess what she might say. The longer I waited, the more scenarios ran through my head. None of them good. When Nicole finally walked in, she looked uneasy, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. A small, nervous smile tugged at her lips as she slid into the seat across from me. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, curling her hands around the cup the barista had just set in front of her. "What's this about, Nicole?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. She took a long breath, holding it for a second before letting it out. "I've been carrying this guilt since you left," she admitted, avoiding my eyes. "I need to tell you the truth." My stomach nodded. "Go on." Nicole hesitated, fidgeting with her sleeve, but when she started talking, the words came out fast, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she stopped. "Sarah's been seeing someone, a guy from work. His name's Brian. Started a few months back. At first, it was just harmless flirting, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Then it turned into something more." My jaw clenched as I tightened my grip around the cup, trying to stay composed. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why let me walk around in the dark?" Nicole's gaze dropped to the table. "I didn't know how," she said quietly. "Sarah's my sister, but that doesn't make what she did right." I tried talking to her when I realized how serious it was. I told her to stop. I exhaled, waiting for the rest. "She wouldn't listen," Nicole continued, her voice trembling slightly. "She said Brian made her feel alive, in a way she hadn't felt in years." The words hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. I swallowed hard, forcing down the bitterness rising in my throat. "Did she ever love me?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. Nicole's expression softened, and she reached across the table, resting her hand over mine for a brief second. "She did, Daniel," she said, her voice low and sincere. "I know she did, but somewhere along the way she lost sight of it. She stopped appreciating what she had. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it's the truth." I nodded stiffly, the knot in my throat tightening. "Thank you for telling me. There's more," Nicole added, looking away briefly as if debating whether to continue. "Sarah doesn't know I'm here. She's been trying to reach you. She wants to talk, to explain herself." I shook my head before she could finish. "There's nothing she can say that'll change things," I replied firmly. "I've made my peace with it, or at least I'm trying to." Nicole offered a faint smile, but her eyes mirrored the weight of everything left unspoken. "You're a good man, Daniel," she said, giving my hand a light squeeze. "You didn't deserve any of this. I hope you find someone who knows that." I left the coffee shop feeling strangely lighter, though the heaviness hadn't completely lifted. Nicole's confession confirmed what I had long suspected. In a way, it was the closure I didn't realize I needed. Sarah's actions weren't a reflection of me or my worth. They were her choices. She'd been chasing something she thought was missing, and in doing so, she'd torn apart the life we had built together. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I pulled out the journal I had taken from the house. I flipped through the journal's worn pages, reading over entries where I had once poured out my love for Sarah. Dreams I had for our future together, hopes I had scribbled down late at night. For the first time, those memories didn't cut like knives. They felt distant, like echoes from another life. They were simply part of the story, a chapter that had ended. I closed the journal and slid it back onto the shelf. It was time to start writing the next one. The crisp autumn air had a bite to it as I strolled down the tree-lined street. Golden leaves crunched beneath my boots with each step. 3 months had passed since I left Sarah. The sting of betrayal still lingered, but I was starting to feel something else. A quiet sense of peace. My life wasn't defined by what I had lost anymore. It was shaped by what I was building for myself. Woodworking had become more than just a distraction. I'd transformed the small garage behind my apartment into a makeshift workshop, and orders for custom pieces were trickling in. Word of mouth carried faster than I expected, and suddenly, I found myself busy crafting tables and bookshelves for people I'd never met. The act of taking raw wood and turning it into something beautiful, something functional, felt grounding. But it wasn't just the work that kept me moving forward. I had started reconnecting with old friends, grabbing beers or coffee, and rediscovering parts of myself I had set aside during my marriage. I'd even gone on a few dates, not looking for anything serious, but enough to remind me that I wasn't invisible. There were people out there who saw value in me, and that realization, strange as it was, felt exhilarating and terrifying all at once. One afternoon, while browsing a local bookstore, I met someone who stood out. Her name was Katie. She had auburn hair that framed her face in loose waves and a smile that seemed to brighten the entire room. I noticed her standing in one of the aisles, flipping through a book on photography, studying it carefully like she was looking for something in between the pages. "You know, that one's really good," I said, nodding toward the book in her hands. "The author explains light and shadow in a way that actually makes sense." She looked up, surprised at first, then smiled. "You're a photographer?" "Not really," I admitted. "I dabble, mostly landscapes. Woodworking's more my thing." Her eyes lit up with curiosity. "That's so cool. I've always admired people who can make something with their hands." The conversation flowed effortlessly from there, as if we had known each other for years. Before I knew it, we were sitting in the bookstore cafe, laughing over cups of coffee. Katie had this way of making me feel comfortable, like I didn't need to be anything other than who I already was. She shared stories about her work as a freelance graphic designer, and I found myself opening up in return. I told her about my life, where I'd been, the mistakes I'd made, and the path I was trying to carve out now. The afternoon slipped by faster than I wanted it to. As Katie glanced at her watch, she sighed softly. "I hate to cut this short, but I've got a deadline I can't ignore," she said with a small smile. "This was really nice." "It was," I agreed, feeling warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Maybe we could do it again sometime?" She grinned, grabbed a napkin, and scribbled down her number before sliding it across the table. "Call me." I watched her walk away, a strange blend of hope and cautious excitement stirring inside me. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was subtle, like the faintest flicker of light breaking through clouds. That night, as I sat in my apartment, I reflected on how much had changed. The man who quietly packed his things and slipped out of Sarah's house in the dead of night felt distant, a shadow of who I was becoming. I wasn't foolish enough to think I was completely healed. The scars were still there, and sometimes, when the silence crept in, the weight of it all tried to settle back on my shoulders. But those moments didn't last as long as they used to. I was learning to value myself in ways I hadn't before. Sarah's betrayal had forced me to confront parts of myself I had ignored, the ambitions I'd pushed aside, the strength I didn't realize I had, and the life I thought I couldn't rebuild. It wasn't the path I had chosen, but it was mine now, and I was determined to make something out of it. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it was the one I found myself on, and I was determined to walk it with purpose. A few days later, I was back at the bookstore with Katie. What started as a casual meeting stretched into hours of conversation and laughter. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something real, something I hadn't thought I'd feel again. It was too early to know where it might lead, but that didn't seem to matter. For now, the connection was enough. The months passed, slowly turning into a year. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. There was a steadiness to it, a quiet sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in a long time. Sarah reached out a couple of times during that year. She left voicemails I never returned. I didn't hate her anymore. Truthfully, I didn't feel much of anything when I saw her name light up my phone. I realized forgiveness wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment I had carried for far too long. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It simply meant moving forward without looking back. One bright afternoon, I stood in my workshop, finishing the last few strokes of sanding on a chair I'd been working on. I stepped back to admire it, running my hand over the smooth grain of the wood. But as I stood there, I realized it wasn't just the chair I was proud of. It was everything I had built since that night I left. My life, like the wood beneath my hands, had been reshaped, sanded down, and strengthened. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole.